Hello, I'm Namo Abdulla in Washington, and welcome to Inside America. Unmanned aerial vehicles, commonly known as drones, have once again become the subject of a heated debate here in the United States and across the globe. That's because rights groups have just published new details about the unintended impacts of the drone campaign that the Obama administration has pursued, more than any other administration preceding him, to kill terrorist leaders in other countries. In two separate reports, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International say American drones have not only killed scores of civilians in Pakistan and Yemen, but also caused terror among the tribal populations caught between vicious militants and the U.S. drones hunting them. The United States, however, insists that using unmanned aircrafts is an effective tool to weaken Al-Qaeda and its offshoots across the globe. Joining me to discuss the subject are Andrea Prasow, a senior counter-terrorism counsel and advocate at the Human Rights Watch in Washington, D.C. She investigates and analyzes U.S. counter-terrorism policies and practices. Daniel Green, a political analyst at the Washington Institute. He focuses on Yemen, Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me start off with you, Andrea. You just published this report about the drone campaign of the Obama administration in Yemen. Can you tell us what is new about the report?
Well, we've documented 6 targeted killings in Yemen, many by drone. One was a cruise missile, and others were assisted by drones. So we just refer to them as airstrikes in general. And in 2 cases, we documented unlawful killings of civilians. And in the 4 other cases, we believe that there were potentially unlawful killings. We don't have enough information to draw final conclusions. So we're asking the Obama administration to investigate these killings and any other potentially unlawful killings.
So the United States has kept saying that these drone strike is very effective and it's also precise. It doesn't kill civilians, but your report suggests the otherwise, right?
Right, and I want to be clear on what our report doesn't do. We're not calling for an end to the use of drones, and we're not criticizing drones as weapons per se, because it's true that drones actually can be quite precise, and because of that, they can be more protective of civilian life if used correctly. But what we have documented here are instances where drones or other air weapons are used and civilians have been killed indiscriminately. We've also documented the impact that these killings have had on the local communities.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, those impacts?
Absolutely. The title of our report is Between a Drone and Al-Qaeda, and this is what a witness told us. He said, I am caught on the one hand between a U.S. drone and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in the other. Local Yemenis fear Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. They don't want to be living in areas surrounded by terrorists. Yet their only image of the United States is often through the use of drones. And when they have gone to the site of a drone strike and looked at the charred bodies of their family members, that's the image that they take away with them about the United States.
Daniel, I would like to move to you now. The Obama administration has used drones more than all other administrations preceding him. Is it really that effective? And given the fact that she says so many civilians also die as a result of this drone strike, is it really worth it?
I think the thing that's really encouraging about this report is how few civilians are being killed now in terms of the past usage of drones. There are far fewer, it's much more calibrated, and also, too, a lot of the communities, non-governmental organizations and their advocacy groups have long called for the sort of suspension of drone strikes. So to me, this is a progress report that's very encouraging because it still says these are useful tools. There's been improvement in many cases that fewer civilians are being killed. But I think no one wants drones to be a permanent policy. To me, it's a temporary approach to a very intractable problem that needs other solutions.
So, but under the George W. Bush administration, as far as I remember, he used drones a few times. Right. His focus was more on using boots on the ground. Do you prefer using like these unmanned vehicles to sending commandos, like actual troops, to other countries? Well,
it's the thing. If not drones, then what? Right. So as you mentioned, there are commandos or special forces units, whether they could be American or Yemeni, but also what are other approaches? And these other approaches may actually have more potential civilian casualties than simply drones. I think you have to have a holistic approach to confronting Al-Qaeda that confronts not just their military strategy, but also their political strategy in these villages that the report references. And what that requires really is sort of enduring local security, not sort of what the Yemeni military often does, which is clear villages and then leave. That always leaves a civilian population in a sort of a rock and a hard place, if you will.
But what many people wonder around the world is that the United States is not quite transparent about what it's doing in Yemen and Pakistan. Why is it like that? Is it because I mean, what should we draw from the fact that they are not transparent about it?
Sure. You know, unlike Iraq and Afghanistan, where the sovereignty of these governments was sort of being reestablished or built from scratch in many places, you know, Pakistan and Yemen obviously have their own sovereign governments. And the arrangement that the United States has with these governments is something that these governments have chosen as the best in terms of their interests. There isn't much transparency, but that's primarily because those governments sort of want things to be maintained that way. These governments are intimately involved in these drone strikes in terms of helping select targets, provide information for them. There's a back and forth between the U.S. and these governments on which strikes to make, etc. But I think it's not completely straightforward to say the U.S. is just doing this without the knowledge of these governments.
Andrea, your reports, your researchers, have they talked to the civilians? Of course they have on the ground. Do they complain about their own governments for at least tacitly cooperating with the United States in its drone campaign?
Well, in the case of Yemen, President Hadi has been quite explicit publicly and said that the drones are there with his consent. He's happy to have the U.S. conducting these strikes. And that actually highlights how ridiculous the secrecy is on the part of the U.S. government. If the Yemeni government acknowledges that the U.S. is playing a role, why shouldn't the U.S. government? And, the local Yemenis that we've talked to who've been affected by these strikes have told us that they believe any airstrike is conducted by the United States. Even though the Yemeni military does also engage in strikes, they don't have drone technology, but they do have other weapons. The Saudis may be involved, other governments may be involved. So the U.S. is taking the hit when it comes to public opinion because people just assume any airstrike has been conducted by the United States. So in a certain respect, coming clean about what strikes the U.S. has conducted might actually reduce the negative public opinion that people have about it.
There's definitely a negative public opinion all over the world about the use of drones. But what is the public opinion here in the United States? Do Americans support using drones?
I think so, overwhelmingly. I think, as you mentioned earlier, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's sort of a war fatigue in the American public. People are sort of tired of the cost of these wars, and they're looking for essentially a light, lean, sort of low-cost approach that sort of addresses some elements of the challenge of al-Qaeda, but does it in a way that's fiscally sustainable, that doesn't sort of put U.S. lives at risk, and is sort of supportable for the long term.
I remember, Daniel, at National Defense University here in Washington, D.C., President Obama, about a few months ago, he pledged to reduce the use of drones. Has he really reduced ever since he made his speech? If you have any statistics or if your observations, what can you tell us?
Well, I think going back to the report's sort of question of transparency, it's sometimes hard to figure out how many drone strikes are happening and what's occurring. My sense is that there has been a diminishment of those strikes, but other tools are being used. As you saw recently, there were some commando raids in Libya and Somalia to attack and capture some al-Qaeda members. But also, too, the Yemeni government in particular has been more, I think, stabilizing more, is more able to do the kind of things it needs to do to secure its own population. So it's a transition process, I think.
Andrea, how do you said some of the acts were clearly unlawful? How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, there are two strikes that we are calling unlawful because they indiscriminately killed civilians. And one strike involved the use of cluster munitions, which we believe are a weapon that is just inherently incapable of discriminating properly between combatants and civilians. And that's an essential requirement under the laws of war. In the second attack, there was a vehicle that was struck, which only civilians were killed. There was an intended target. He had been on the road earlier that day. He was nowhere nearby. So again, this is our analysis that that's just an indiscriminate attack.
Sorry, when you say unlawful, do you mean they're unlawful by the international law or by the U.S. law?
They violate international law, which is part of U.S. law. But I do want to be clear that in neither of these strikes are we alleging intent. We are not suggesting that the U.S. government deliberately targeted civilians. But what we are saying is that the government failed.
Unintended, like consequences.
Unintended, but this isn't just a case of what some people consider appropriate collateral damage. This is a failure to follow the laws of war, the laws that the U.S. military trains itself to follow. In these two cases, civilians were killed indiscriminately, which is a violation of the laws of war.
Can you elaborate more on that? Why did it fail to follow the rules of war?
The laws of war require that a warring party distinguish between combatants and civilians. So, for example, you can't just let loose fire in a public marketplace. You have to identify a combatant. It's true that sometimes civilians can lawfully be killed. A combatant might be targeted and civilians may die in a particular strike. But you can't just fire into an open marketplace or bomb a school thinking there might be a lawful target inside it. So that's the case with these two strikes that we've documented. But what we've also done in this report is we've gone through the president's policy that he discussed in May. He unveiled this policy in May, which has a preference for capture. So, for example, we identify strikes where the target easily could have been captured. He had regular contact with local security forces. And instead of being captured, he was lethally targeted and civilians were killed. Now, we don't know when the policy came into effect. When President Obama unveiled it, he said parts of it were already in place and others would be implemented later. So in part, this report is identifying areas where the policy may not have been followed, but it also serves as a recommendation. We show examples of why the policy is essential, why you should capture people whenever feasible, rather than use lethal targeting.
It quite makes sense that capturing a terrorist is better than killing him, not just for the fact that you reduce the amount of civilians that might be killed in a drone strike, but also for intelligence purposes, right? Can you talk about that? For example, like the U.S. government just captured Anas al-Libi in Libya. He's a gold mine, right?
Sure. Well, I think it's very easy to say it's easy to capture terrorists, but how do you get to the target? How do you gain entry to their facility? How do you do it in a way that you're not detected? There's all sorts of possible civilian casualties en route to the target of a unit that's on the ground. I mean, the practical considerations of implementing that, I mean, it's just much more difficult than to just say, I mean, if you think about the Somalia case, it was a house right on the shore. I mean, imagine a home that's in the middle of Hadramaut, the governorate, in central Yemen. It's much more difficult to get there because Al-Qaeda has a series of people to look for, coalition or Yemeni security services. They have an early warning system. I mean, it's far more challenging to do that. I mean, it's easy to say, but I think just logistically it's very difficult to do that without having, collateral damage.
I'd like to go back to the legality of the use of drones. She clearly laid out two cases where they were unlawful. That's what they say. But does the use of drones really doesn't it violate the sovereignty of the nation as well? Even though they give permission, how is it in the international law? If a country gives you permission to attack it, is that still a violation of the sovereignty?
Well, sovereignty has rights and responsibilities, right? So it's got two sides of it. And the Yemeni government is actively involved in this process. And absolutely countries don't want to violate other countries' sovereignties, but at the same time, if there are threats emanating from that country, they have an obligation to follow through and to provide the kind of security for their people and to protect other countries from threats that come from it. So I think it's not black or white, but I think this is sort of a hybrid approach that is generally effective, but I think there are other ways of doing these kinds of things in the long term. I think drones are a temporary approach to a current problem. They're not a long-term solution.
But do you think that they have been effective so far in weakening Al-Qaeda?
Absolutely. But it's a tactic, not a strategy, and it's not a long-term strategy at the end of the day.
Some people could say that using drones could actually recruit more Al-Qaeda members because, there are so many people who will be terrified and who will be maybe encouraged by the fact that you send just an unmanned aircraft to kill them.
Right, absolutely. I think that's correct. That's why I think when you use drones, you have to be very calibrated, very careful. And I think there has been an evolution in thinking within the U.S. military in particular about how to use drones. I think there was, earlier in the years of the program, the intelligence wasn't as good, the drones technology wasn't as advanced, and there were some other challenges that I think led to greater civilian casualties. I think over time there's been an improvement in terms of fewer civilian casualties. But also in terms of war, you're never going to have a zero casualty war as much as you try to. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try to have that, but it's very difficult when you deal with people. They're imperfect, and you should always endeavor to do what you can to reduce those attacks.
Andrea, is there a specific town or city in Yemen where the report is focused, or are Al-Qaeda scattered all over Yemen? The 6 strikes occurred in 6 different places. Certainly, none of them occurred in Sana'a, in the capital city, which is differently situated than other parts of Yemen. In certain parts, the Yemeni government doesn't have complete control over those areas, and we recognize that. But the cases we've identified, for example, where people could have been captured, are cases where local government did have the ability, we believe, to actually capture someone. It wouldn't have required the U.S. to send in a particular special forces team. And the president himself identified that as part of the new policy, that capture will be a preference wherever feasible. So we think that's a very good sign.
Why don't you give us some basic information about where Al-Qaeda is active now in Afghanistan and Yemen? Like, if you give us a more global perspective, that would be great.
Sure. The Arab Spring was initially sort of seen as this possible sort of option against Al-Qaeda. The aspirations of the Arabic people would be met, and Al-Qaeda's sort of appeal would sort of diminish. And I think Al-Qaeda is really taking advantage of this period of time to sort of reconstitute itself. Yemen, in many ways, has become more and more the central hub of Al-Qaeda globally. Certainly, they're still very active, obviously, in Pakistan and parts of Afghanistan. But I think, in general, Yemen's assuming a much more central position in the organization globally. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the Yemeni branch of Al-Qaeda, is definitely benefiting from the Arab Spring in Yemen. There's been a period of transition, as you know, to the new president there. And there are these large sort of internal safe havens, if you will, within Yemen, where the government of Yemen has no real security presence or any government presence whatsoever. And Al-Qaeda has really taken advantage of that. In particular, in 2011, they overran large parts of southern Yemen and then tried to administer it as a government. And they've subsequently been pushed out of those areas. But Al-Qaeda is reconstituting itself, has switched back to more of an insurgency position versus a sort of a conventional warfare position, and is undertaking a pretty impressive murder and intimidation campaign on the population, as well as on the Yemeni security services and intelligence services. So,
in Pakistan or Waziristan, the drones are used to kill Taliban members, not Al-Qaeda, right?
They're used to kill both. If they're non-Al-Qaeda members, that's typically they're leaders of Taliban factions that have been known to attack Pakistan in particular. But yes.
What about in Iraq? Has there been any recent use of drones in Iraq?
Not to my knowledge, but the U.S. government's in negotiations right now with Iraq to see if there might be a new security relationship or partnership to work with them against the resurgent Al-Qaeda there, as you know, I'm sure.
Sorry, Andrea. Why don't you come back to some more details of the report? I read the Amnesty International report as well. It really paints a very terrifying picture from the perspective of the civilians living there. Can you tell us more about really what the civilians felt about those drones?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has acted somewhat differently from the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, in that while Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula clearly would like to and has tried to attack the U.S., it hasn't, in general, attacked Yemeni civilians. It's attacked the Yemeni government. It has positioned itself as against the Yemeni government. Also, they have attacked police officers, which we consider them to be civilians, but I think AQAP considers them to be part of the security apparatus. So I don't want to minimize any of the attacks, but as was noted, at times they've administered the town and provided water. They have been quite clever in not necessarily alienating the local population the same way that Al-Qaeda and or the Taliban have in Pakistan. So that actually makes the U.S., the view of the U.S. that much more challenging, because it's not the case that any action that the United States takes against AQAP is necessarily seen immediately as alleviating a problem. For some of these Yemenis who have suffered from the drone strikes, the only immediate problem in their lives is coming from the United States, not from AQAP. So that really makes it quite challenging. And I have to say, one of the things that is sort of most tragic about these cases when you examine them closely is how frustrated people are that there's been almost no acknowledgement of what happened. I mean, the U.S. has not acknowledged the 6 strikes that we've examined in our report. And in addition to the fact that people have received little or no compensation, they've never had anyone say, this happened and we're sorry. And that really would go a long way towards changing the perception that people have about the United States.
Daniel, I would like to move to you now. This notion of saying sorry for the loss of others.
Sure.
I remember during the election campaigns, Mitt Romney accused President Obama of being too apologetic to other people. Don't you think the United States should be sorry for killing those civilians who are collateral damage, if you will, if you wish, as a result of the drone strikes?
And, you know, it's a Yemeni U.S. government program, and absolutely, I think it's important to compensate people who have been killed unjustly. Absolutely, I think that's not just important because of a justice concern, but also in terms of a potential recruiting tool for Al-Qaeda. But I just have to disagree slightly. I think Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, when it administered southern Yemen, was quite brutal on the population, killed a lot of people, not just security services, tribal leaders, and others. I mean, there were thousands upon thousands of sort of war refugees from these areas that Al-Qaeda was administering. And as much as Al-Qaeda tries to have sort of a hearts and minds campaign to win the support of the population, you know, when they finally get to power and control an area, you know, they're sort of brutal rule, you know, surfaces. I think that's something to consider. I mean, Al-Qaeda is not known for sort of, you know, protecting the innocent. I mean, historically, it's kind of unusual they would try to adapt that just to Yemen.
So in Yemen, Al-Qaeda, is it really, I would like to emphasize on that, is there a specific rural town, or is it even, you can have Al-Qaeda in urban areas as well, or is there a specific place where Al-Qaeda is based?
Sure. There's sort of several governorates where it has a lot of strength. Abyan Governorate, Shabwa, and Hadramaut are the key sort of governorates where it has power. But its reach is throughout the country in many ways. Its center of strength is really these inner parts of Yemen. But it's able to assassinate and launch operations in different parts of the country. I think its ability to kill intelligence officers, security officials, and military officials fairly easily is really impressive, because what it requires is a real infrastructure to do that, to understand where your target lives, etc., understand his or her, you know, pattern of life, etc. So I think this suggests there's a much more pervasive network of Al-Qaeda throughout Yemen than we may be aware.
Like for me, it seems that the war on terror under President Obama has taken a completely new turn and different turn from the kind of war that George W. Bush launched against terrorists across the globe. What are the differences and similarities that you see between the two policies?
Well, I think sometimes an administration's approach is reflective of the changing nature of the conflict itself. You know, I think with Iraq and Afghanistan drawing down and sort of a general fatigue in the United States and budgetary concerns and economic concerns here at home, I think there's a natural shift to have a greater emphasis on drones, use of special operations forces, and then also crucially relying on indigenous governments and a stronger sort of spirit of partnership to sort of work with them to confront common problems. I think that's sort of a light, lean, but long-term approach to these kind of enduring threats.
So, Andrea, I would like to come back to you for one more question before we take a short commercial break. You said that you're not asking for the U.S. government to put an end to the use of drones in any of the countries. But what is your message? Don't you, as the Human Rights Watch, you usually have a message to all governments whenever they violate human rights, you tell them to stop violating human rights. I've read most of your reports about Kurdistan, Iraq, Iran. Why don't you send the same message to the United States?
Our message absolutely is to stop violating human rights. But our position is not that any drone being used anywhere, anytime, necessarily violates human rights. The issue here is that we've documented the unlawful killings of civilians, and we've documented 6 strikes. There certainly may be others. I mean, there have been many more drone strikes than the 6 that we were able to examine for this report. So first, we're calling for increased transparency from the Obama administration about what legal framework it believes it's operating in. You know, we examined these strikes using the laws of war, but we have also questioned whether the laws of war really should apply. Certainly, there is an internal armed conflict in Yemen between the Yemeni government and AQAP, and we absolutely recognize that. However, the U.S. has said that it's not a party to that conflict, that it is engaged in an armed conflict with Al-Qaeda and associated forces pursuant to domestic U.S. legislation. So sometimes it's difficult to analyze that. And even the conflict with Al-Qaeda and the U.S. at all, you know, it's not clear that now it really is an armed conflict, such that the laws of war should apply. And if the laws of war don't apply, then human rights law applies, which is law enforcement standards. And that's a different standard for taking human life. You can't just kill a target because you have access to him. You have to try to arrest the target, and you can only use lethal action if that person poses an imminent threat to human life. So it's very important to understand what the legal standards are. You know, the second thing we're calling for very clearly, because we have documented human rights violations, we're calling for investigations. And there need to be consequences to those investigations. It may be that prosecutions would be appropriate, but we don't know. We don't have all the facts. It may be that a change in policy would be appropriate. We just don't know, but we want those investigations to take place. And then finally, we are calling for compensation, and no-fault compensation. This is something that happened in Iraq, it happens in Afghanistan routinely. When civilians are killed, whether it was legitimate collateral damage, if that's what you want to call it, or whether it's just a pure accident, a misfire, someone aimed in the wrong direction, just compensate the civilians and apologize for the loss. And the U.S. doesn't have to take responsibility and identify that someone was wrong in terms of providing immediate compensation.
It's definitely crucial to at least compensate for the losses and, apologize for them to alleviate some of their pain. That's at least what people might think are all over the world. But after this commercial break, we will come back to continue our discussion with Andrea Prasow and Daniel Green of the Washington Institute. Hello again and welcome back to Inside America. Daniel, let me come back to you. Does any other country in the world use drones at the moment?
The drone technology sort of started in the U.S. in many ways, is still being perfected, but absolutely the technology is no longer limited to just the U.S. China in particular has drones, Iran has drones, many of the larger powers have drones, and their technology is advancing.
But they have drones, but they don't use it, right?
No, absolutely, they do use them. Whether they use them for military purposes in terms of attacking an enemy, I don't think that's been shown just yet. They're often for observing targets, collecting intelligence, things of that nature. And along those lines, the Yemeni government's actually asked for its own drones, and I think there's a process the U.S. is going through now to see what kinds of drones it might be able to give to Yemen to help it confront its own problems.
There's a certain drone that's used to collect intelligence. I think Hezbollah was also reported to have obtained those kind of drones. Do you have any information about that?
Nothing specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised. The technology itself isn't particularly advanced on the older models, if you will. So it's easy to replicate this and see this technology sort of proliferate. But the higher end models are still sort of owned by the United States, and there's even look now to sort of allow commercial enterprises to purchase drones. So that's being looked at within the U.S. government as well.
Andrea, you raised the issue of transparency before the break. Can you explain to our viewers the places where the United States doesn't want to be transparent and you have concerns about them?
Right. So there's a total lack of transparency when it comes to who is actually being killed by these strikes. I mean, the U.S. has not acknowledged these strikes. In Yemen, the strikes are largely conducted by the Joint Special Operations Command, which is part of the military. Nevertheless, some of them may be conducted under covert authority. So while it's a little bit easier for the U.S. to acknowledge these strikes, they haven't. In Pakistan, the program is largely covert, conducted by the CIA. And it wasn't until President Obama himself essentially acknowledged the program that anybody could even really talk about it publicly.
It hasn't just recently been handed over to the Defense Department.
It has not. President Obama did suggest that was a plan, and that's something Human Rights Watch has long called for. I think it's something that will happen. I think it's incredibly important because the CIA, by its very nature, is just not capable of providing the sort of transparency that is required under international law. And if we're going to continue to talk about this, imaginary program that everybody knows is taking place, it's really ridiculous. I mean, the other area where the administration has not been transparent is about the legal framework. The Obama administration has said that it's engaged in an armed conflict with al-Qaeda and associated forces. It has refused to identify who those associated forces are. Senior Defense Department officials testified before Congress and said in a hearing they would not provide that information to the public, but would only provide it in a classified setting. And the policy that the president unveiled in May at his NDU speech, he unveiled a public summary of the policy, and the White House issued a public fact sheet, but the actual policy is classified. There's a document called the Presidential Policy Guidance, which is classified. So there is a secret set of rules that governs targeting terrorists, and there's a secret list of who those enemies are. And that's incredibly problematic, not only because of what the U.S. government is doing, but also the precedent it sets for other nations.
Do you agree with what she's saying, that the drones should be transferred to the Defense Department because the CIA wants to keep things secret?
Well, just as a U.S. citizen, I want whatever is required to protect the U.S. population, I'm supportive of, obviously. If it makes sense to transition it to the Defense Department, then perhaps that's the way to go forward. Sorry for me to say.
Also, that's many other people have said this. CIA is a spy organization. The use of drones, this policy has turned CIA into a paramilitary group.
Well, I mean, bureaucracies adapt to new challenges, right? I mean, obviously the CIA came out of Pearl Harbor and the experiences of World War II and the Office of Strategic Services, so primarily was focused on strategic intelligence gathering. You know, it's adapted to the 9/11 challenges after 9/11, as has the military. I mean, just because the bureaucracy was doing one thing doesn't mean it can't adjust as well. So I'm not as concerned with that, but I agree with the concerns of transparency for sure. But at the same time, we're fighting a war in the shadows. Sometimes true transparency, too much sunshine, if you will, can burn things and not protect you.
In his NDU speech, President Obama sought to put an end to the war on terror. Mm-hmm. Some people thought that was too premature, like John McCain. He said it was far from reality. Right. So do you think it is time really to put an end to the war on terror? And many people have a lot of problems with even the term war on terror. Like, who do you really fight?
Sure. Well, there's a great expression that sort of says, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Unfortunately, al-Qaeda is an adaptable opponent and is taking advantage of the sort of chaotic conditions of the Arab Spring to reconstitute itself. Al-Qaeda, for example, in western Iraq, as you know, in Anbar province, has reconstituted itself, is doing very, very well as it feeds off the crisis in Syria. And Al-Qaeda in Yemen is doing the same thing. It's a very strong organization. It's adapted to the Yemeni context and is now providing leadership to other affiliates around the world, in Mali in particular, and other parts of the world. So I think it's very premature to say that the war against al-Qaeda is over. It's just evolving and adapting, and it's sort of something that will be part of our sort of immediate future for a while.
Mm-hmm. So, but some people, I remember, like to go into the a previous discussion that was there when George W. Bush was in power. I remember some linguists that suggested that the entire phrase war on terror is wrong, and one suggested that you should change it to a global struggle against extremists. Like, does that make a difference?
Well, the Obama administration has disavowed the expression anyway. I mean, they don't say there's a war on terror. They say there's a war against al-Qaeda and associated forces. But the question of how to effectively counter terrorism is a very different one from, is there an actual armed conflict? Whether or not there's an armed conflict is an objective question. It's a question of international law. And Human Rights Watch has called into question whether there still is an armed conflict such that the laws of war apply, which has nothing to do with whether al-Qaeda poses a threat. Of course it does. And of course terrorists everywhere pose a threat to peace-loving people everywhere. And terrorism is a very serious problem.
Can al-Qaeda in Yemen pose a threat to an existential threat to the United States?
Well, existential threat is a pretty serious threat. Certainly, AQAP wants to attack the United States.
Could they threaten?
Well, another component of the president's policy that was very interesting was that he said that lethal force would only be used against people who pose a threat to U.S. persons. And in the past, it was clear that people who pose a threat to U.S. persons, U.S. interests, or perhaps U.S. allies could be targeted. So I think that does actually represent a shift on the part of the U.S. government when it comes to policy, that the use of lethal force, the use of drones or other airstrikes should only come into play when someone is actually trying to attack people in the United States or Americans abroad.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to go to killing, because there's a difference here in America between killing American citizens, at least by the law, and killing foreigners. There was one American citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki, in Yemen, I think. He was killed, and there's still a lot of debate whether you can kill an American citizen on foreign soil without due process of the law.
Well,
what is your perspective as the Human Rights Watch about?
There are questions about domestic law, sure. I mean, what does the Constitution require? But under international law, someone who is a legitimate target because they're part of an enemy force or they're directly participating in hostilities, they remain a legitimate target regardless of their citizenship. So the question isn't, why was Anwar al-Awlaki killed, or the 3 other U.S. citizens who were killed in Yemen? What about the hundreds of other people who were killed in Yemen? We need transparency about all of the strikes, not just the ones against U.S. citizens.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki? Do you think that was illegal, as some rights groups suggested?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, he sort of knew he was associated with al-Qaeda. He was a leader of al-Qaeda in many cases. He had been the inspiration for a number of al-Qaeda attacks within the United States, or attempts to have attacks. I understand sort of the legal perspective on that, but you know, we're in a war and things sometimes happen and have to happen. But in terms of transparency, I think absolutely transparency is important on the U.S. side, but the same is true for al-Qaeda. How many people have been killed by al-Qaeda in Yemen? How many of them have never received compensation from al-Qaeda, nor an apology? You know, that is far above any U.S. killings, which are generally unintentional, than what al-Qaeda has undertaken. People will expect the U.S. to follow a higher standard, and absolutely we should be held to that, but al-Qaeda should be equally sort of looked at and said, you know, you're not doing what you say you're doing. You're brutalizing the population. You're abusing it. I think you need to be held accountable for that as well.
You know, I think that's absolutely right, and it's not a question of the U.S. being held to a higher standard, but each party should be held to the same standard, but the failure of one party to comply with the law doesn't mean that another party can also violate the law. So while, you know, we've documented the strikes of civilians who've been killed in attacks against terrorists, in no way do we minimize the damage that terrorists have caused to civilians. Terrorists have killed many more civilians, as Daniel said, than U.S. drone strikes. But there are different issues that need to be addressed differently.
Andrea, the United Nations, I think, is also going to have its own report on the drone strikes in the next few days. To your information, has the United Nations condemned any of these drone attacks so far? Has it considered illegal, any of you?
Well, there are two separate United Nations reports that are being presented to the General Assembly this week. There are two different special rapporteurs who are essentially UN officials who've been tasked with a special job. One looks at what are called extrajudicial executions, and one looks at counterterrorism and human rights. And both of those reports are critical of the targeted killing programs. They don't detail specific strikes. But they are both calling for increased transparency. So I think it's actually quite important. We're here talking about this issue, which is incredibly important, and to look at it in the context. There are two UN reports out this week. Amnesty International has their report on targeted killings in Pakistan. Human Rights Watch has our report on targeted killings in Yemen. I mean, this is a big issue.
Is there a collaborative effort between all of you, or?
Not between us and the United Nations. So Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International investigated and wrote our reports entirely independently. But when we realized that we were coming to similar conclusions, we decided that it would be effective to release them on the same day and provide an opportunity to talk about both Yemen and Pakistan at the same time. And in many respects, we have similar conclusions. Both organizations are calling for increased transparency. Both organizations are calling for investigations into the specific unlawful killings that we've documented, and both organizations are calling for congressional investigations.
I'd like to take another short break, but after the break we will come back to continue our discussion. Please stay with us. Hello again and welcome back to Inside America. We're discussing the drone campaign that has been used by President Obama more than any other president in the U.S. history. And now I'd like to come back to you, Daniel. Okay, there are many criticism over the use of drones. Many people don't like it all over the world. Maybe in the United States there's a support for it because you don't send American soldiers to other countries and they won't be killed in other countries. But do we have a feasible alternative to the use of drones in fighting terror?
You know, often these drones are used in areas that the local government is unable to control. They don't have security forces there. They have no civil administration. And the real sort of long-term, sort of fundamental, I think, solution for a lot of these challenges is to help these indigenous governments, if you will, expand their sovereignty internally, to allow them to expand their security services in a way that allows them to stay in a community, to protect that community, to extend political reform and civil administration to these areas as well. Because that way, al-Qaeda doesn't have a safe haven from which to operate. It can't intimidate the population, these kinds of things. And that requires sort of an active enlistment of these communities that are stuck between al-Qaeda and the drones, as the report references, so enlist them in their own defense. So in that way, they're able to confront al-Qaeda, not just militarily, but also politically, and prevent them from really gaining any inroads with the population.
Mm-hmm. But I think you mentioned that earlier in the discussion as well. You should address the root causes of terrorism rather than, you know, just using drones to kill them.
Right.
What should be like a robust U.S. strategy to fight terror?
Sure. You know, the challenge is, of course, that the U.S. is not Iraq or Afghanistan. So these countries have governments which have been there for years. And so we have to sort of cultivate a strategy that uses U.S. resources and influence to help these governments see that their interests and ours are aligned in helping to address a lot of these root causes. But it's not simply sort of spending more development money or just having more military spending. It has to be a coordinated, synchronized approach in partnership with the Yemeni government that then allows the military to clear out these areas of al-Qaeda, enlist the population in its own defense, and allow sort of remaining sort of security force there to prevent al-Qaeda from coming back, and then creating a political space for communities to do governance and development.
The United States has like almost totally lost interest in really fighting terrorism in Iraq, even though there is a lot of terrorists in Iraq.
Sure.
But when people look at the amount of violence we have in Iraq, they see it as a result of the political differences that Shia and Sunni communities have. They also see it as a result of the failure of U.S. strategy in Iraq. For example, one of the strategies of the United States, as you know, was to recruit and to pay the Sunni insurgents. But it withdrew and the funding was cut off by the Iraqi government. Now those people are insurgents. This is the kind of policy that people don't want to see in other countries, that the United States support, and at some point they just give it up. Right.
Well, I think the Iraqi government had a lot to do with the U.S. pulling out of Iraq in 2011, more so than the U.S. I mean, there are plenty of sort of poor decisions that were made during the Iraq War, to say the least. But in terms of where we are now and what we can do about it now, I think there are some discussions, as I mentioned earlier, between the U.S. and the Iraqi government to see how the U.S. might partner with the Iraqi government to address some of the security threats that al-Qaeda poses. But then through that, too, or through our presence there, maybe help sort of lead to some political reform within Iraq that allows sort of the root political causes that the Sunni population feeds off of to sort of have some of those addressed in some way.
Mm-hmm. Just one more question to you, Daniel, about Syria. President Obama was about to attack Syria like a few weeks ago, and he said he was about to launch an aerial strike against Syria. Can we expect that he might use drones to pursue the Jabhat al-Nusra rebels in Syria, who are fighting Assad?
I've not heard of that talked about specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised, because I think, as you know all too well, the al-Qaeda forces are certainly getting stronger every day. There are at least 50 different nationalities of foreign fighters that are part of al-Qaeda in Syria, and many of them are going to eventually return home. And they're sort of overpowering, if you will, the non-Islamist opposition to President Assad. I wouldn't be surprised that we may see this develop down the road, especially if other military solutions are sort of set aside. I think we may see an increase in drone strikes there, or the beginning of drone strikes.
I'd like to come back to you and ask you about the role of the regional players like Turkey and Saudi Arabia in basically fueling terrorism in Syria and other countries. But now, Andrea, why don't you tell me what the U.S. response has been to your report?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, when we do a report like this, this isn't a gotcha report. We contacted the U.S. government and the Yemeni government in advance of publishing the report, and we asked them detailed questions about the strikes that we've documented. We didn't get an official response from the Yemeni government, although in the report you'll see some anonymous quotes from Yemeni officials. The U.S. government, the administration did not respond to us. The only response we got was from the CIA, which sent us a short note telling us to speak to the White House about these policies. Now, I will say in follow-up, we do have meetings scheduled with various government officials. There has been no formal public response. Both the White House press secretary and the State Department press secretaries have been asked about these reports, and they've essentially just reiterated the U.S. policy is to minimize civilian casualties. Well, I believe that. I think that's true, but that doesn't respond at all to the unlawful killings that we've documented. So we are continuing to press for investigations, for increased transparency, and working through Congress. I think that's something where the American people can be quite helpful, but I also think that's an area where other countries can really be helpful and call for increased transparency from the administration.
Well, while you were saying at least 2 of the attacks were unlawful, can there be any practical steps that you can take against the U.S. government for doing these sort of unlawful practices?
Well, as much as we're confident in our findings, we do recognize that we don't have all of the information. The U.S. government has much more information. So that's why we're calling for a governmental investigation to find out what happened. When strikes are conducted by drones, there is video and also audio. So there are, and the U.S. has said... It
seems impossible. Can, for example, any official being brought to justice because of those unlawful acts?
Well, unfortunately, one of the components of the Obama administration's counterterrorism strategy is to assert state secrets privilege when it comes to any national security issues. So pretty much any lawsuit filed in the United States, whether it's about drones, whether it's about torture, those cases have been dismissed. So it's very challenging for individuals who've been harmed by U.S. counterterrorism strategy to take action on their own.
Daniel, let me come back to you. Now, when we're talking about the war on terror, and of course one of the strategies is the use of drones, but so there are some other countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey. They are now accused of supporting and allowing radical rebels to go into Syria, and the United States has turned a blind eye to it. What do you make of that?
I don't know enough, to be frank, to sort of speak to that as well as I can to Yemen. It's difficult to say. I think it's a very complex challenge in Syria. Unfortunately, I don't know enough to speak as intelligent as I could about other subjects.
But don't you think that while the United States has clearly said that they want, for example, to change the Assad regime in Syria, and the fact that these U.S. allies, Turkey is a NATO ally, Saudi Arabia has been an ally of the United States maybe since World War II, the fact that these countries are supporting rebels who don't share the same goals as the United States government, doesn't that really complicate what the U.S. wants to happen in Syria?
Well, I think it's a question of whether it's official policy or if it's something that's happening that they're not able to necessarily control. I think if you look at the different nationalities, a lot of the foreign fighters, they come from all over the world. There are at least 50 countries, according to my colleague Aaron Zellin, who watches this very closely, that he's documented at least 50 different countries that have had foreign fighters there. And I wouldn't necessarily think that, for example, Finland, which has a number of fighters in Syria, supports, is against U.S. interests. I mean, it's difficult to control and monitor your population sometimes. And those are very porous borders, especially when the Syrian government is broken down and can't control its own sovereignty. So it's difficult for me to say whether these are official policies or things that are occurring that are sort of not intended.
I remember there was an attempted terrorist attack in Times Square by a few years ago. And that man, he cited drones as one of the causes for him to trying to resort to terror in the U.S. Yeah, that's clearly one of the counterproductive results of the use of drones.
Sure. To me, I think that's absolutely a concern, but the question is, why isn't the Pakistani government extending rule of law and services to the federally administered tribal areas? Why isn't it including the Pashtuns into the national population? Why isn't it doing these things for its own people? Same thing for other countries that have essentially terrorist safe havens. Why aren't the Baluch allowed to be playing a stronger role in the life of Pakistan? These are the questions you should put to the Pakistani government. No one wants drones, but the current solution is doing nothing or allowing these groups to proliferate and to grow. So, that's my question to a lot of these governments. Why aren't you doing that?
You mentioned Pakistan. Unlike Yemen, Pakistan has been vocally critical of the United States' use of drones. Can that happen without the agreement of Pakistan?
It has been, but also it's been heavily reported just today that there's a secret agreement between Pakistan and the United States, which everyone assumed anyway. But, there are complicated questions about sovereignty, which is not an area that Human Rights Watch works on. But, has Pakistan secretly consented but benefits from telling its population that it hasn't? But that's an issue with the drone strikes in Yemen and in Pakistan as well, that as long as the U.S. continues to deny its involvement, it just allows either the local government or local terrorist groups to use these strikes to their advantage. So coming clean about them, disclosing how the U.S. is involved and when and how these governments are involved. What role does Pakistan play? What role does Yemen play? I think that will take away some of the tools that these terrorists do have and that the governments have.
We have just one more minute left. I would like to give you 30 seconds and tell us what the United States should do to minimize the loss of civilian casualties. I know so many children and women have been killed.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the U.S. needs to investigate the unlawful killings that we've documented and learn any lessons that are necessary from those. But I do also just want to make sure that your viewers know that our report's available on our website in English and in Arabic in its entirety, and then in other languages in the summary and recommendations. So hopefully this is really accessible to people around the world, and they can call for increased transparency as well.
Can you tell me in 2 words one big flaw and one big advantage of the use of drones?
Well, I think she makes one of the great first points is certainly it can sometimes lead to terrorist groups growing and getting more recruits. The other advantage is in the space between a government having complete control of its territory and doing nothing, it's a temporary tactic to address a security problem.
Daniel Green with the Washington Institute here in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for talking to Rudaw. Andrea Prasow, thank you so much for talking to us. You are with the Human Rights Watch here in Washington, D.C.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, be well.